A black CEO, successful and respected, had built an impressive empire. He had worked hard to rise through the ranks and establish a reputation in the business world. But despite his success, he was always aware of something troubling. Many of his clients, especially those from underrepresented communities, had mentioned feeling uncomfortable or even mistreated when dealing with financial institutions. Over the years, he'd heard countless stories of people of color facing discrimination, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, in the banking world. His own clients, many of them loyal to his bank, had even shared their frustrations with him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how important it was to understand this issue from the ground level. He had built his business to create opportunities for everyone, regardless of race, but what about the bank that he ran? Could it be true that his customers were still facing inequality, even in his own institution? To find the answer, he decided to do something unexpected. He would go undercover. He knew this could be risky. As the CEO of the bank, he had a reputation to protect, and if things went wrong, it could potentially cause harm to his carefully built career. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. He had to know the truth. He thought that by seeing things from the perspective of a regular customer, he could get a clearer understanding of what was really happening behind the scenes. He arranged for a day when he would visit one of his bank's branches. But this time, he wouldn't come in as the CEO. He would disguise himself as just another customer. He was nervous, but he believed it was the only way to truly experience the situation firsthand. On the day of the visit, he put on clothes that didn't stand out. Nothing fancy, nothing too rich-looking, just a regular outfit. He also made sure to avoid any flashy accessories or anything that would give him away. He didn't want anyone to recognize him, and he was determined to blend in. It was a strange feeling for him. For so long, he had been used to being the one people recognized, the one they looked up to. Now he was trying to disappear into the crowd, just another person walking into a bank to take care of some business. When he arrived at the branch, the first thing that struck him was how busy it was. People were lined up waiting to speak with tellers, and the air was filled with the usual noise of phones ringing and customers talking. He took his place in line, pretending to be just another customer, and waited for his turn. As he stood there, he noticed how the tellers interacted with the people ahead of him. Some customers seemed to be treated quickly, while others appeared to be given extra attention. The CEO paid close attention to the small details: how people were greeted, how the staff treated them, and whether there was any hint of favoritism or bias. Finally, it was his turn. He stepped up to the teller's window, keeping his voice steady and calm. He explained that he needed to make a large withdrawal, something simple, just a standard transaction. But when the teller glanced at him, he immediately noticed a shift. There was a hesitation, something he hadn't expected. The teller seemed unsure, almost nervous, and after a few moments she asked for more documentation than he thought was necessary. At first, he chalked it up to the usual paperwork. Maybe there was some new procedure he wasn't aware of. But the longer the transaction went on, the more uncomfortable he began to feel. The teller's eyes kept darting to her computer screen, and she started typing rapidly. It wasn't normal. The CEO began to sense that something wasn't quite right. "Could I speak with your manager, please?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. The teller paused for a moment and then went to the back office. A few minutes later, a manager arrived. He was a tall man in a suit, his face trying to mask any surprise at the request. "Is there an issue with your withdrawal?" the manager asked, his tone a bit too formal. The CEO immediately picked up on the subtle distance in his voice. "I've been a customer here for years," the CEO said, maintaining his composure. "I'm just trying to withdraw some money from my account. But I'm not sure why it's taking so long." The manager smiled awkwardly but didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to the teller, who whispered something to him. The manager then looked back at the CEO and said, "I'm afraid we'll need to verify some of your information before we can complete the transaction." The CEO's patience began to wear thin, but he kept his voice calm. "I've been with this bank for a long time, and I have more than enough funds in my account to cover this withdrawal, so I'm not sure what the issue is." The manager seemed to hesitate, and that's when the CEO realized what was happening. He wasn't being treated like a valued customer. The doubts in the manager's voice, the subtle glances between the teller and the manager, everything pointed to one conclusion: the CEO was being treated differently. Not because of his financial situation, but because of the color of his skin. He felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. This couldn't be happening. This was his own bank, the place he had worked tirelessly to build. It was supposed to be a place where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of their background. But here he was, facing something he never imagined would happen to him. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but it was getting harder by the minute. "I would like to speak with someone else," the CEO said, his voice growing firmer. He knew that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. He was being discriminated against, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. The manager, now visibly uncomfortable, excused himself and left the counter. The CEO stood there, trying to calm his thoughts. It was one thing to hear stories about this kind of treatment, but it was another to experience it himself. The realization hit him hard. Discrimination wasn't just a problem for his customers. It was a problem for his bank, too. As he waited for another staff member to arrive, the CEO reflected on what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just about the transaction being delayed. It was about how easily people like him were being doubted. How something as simple as withdrawing money was being turned into an interrogation. His heart sank. He had to admit the truth. This was not how he expected things to be. He thought he was immune to such treatment, but he wasn't. Now more than ever, he understood that the fight for equality wasn't over. He couldn't let this stand. Something needed to change, and he was the one who had to lead that change. The CEO stood there staring at the empty counter, his mind racing. The branch was still bustling with customers, but in that moment, it felt like everything around him had slowed down. He could hear the faint sounds of distant conversations, the click of keyboards, the hum of the air conditioning, but all of it felt far away. The only thing that truly mattered to him now was what had just happened. He had always known that racism was a problem in society, but he never thought it would touch him directly. After all, he was the CEO, a leader in his community and someone who had fought hard to earn his place. But here he was, standing in his own bank, watching as his own employees doubted him because of the color of his skin. He was a customer, just like any other person who walked in through the doors, and yet, his worth seemed to be questioned in ways that were all too familiar. The discomfort he had initially felt when the teller hesitated had now turned into a full-blown feeling of betrayal. The hesitation in their voices, the way they looked at him like he was somehow suspicious, he couldn't ignore it. He knew this wasn't just about an individual's mistake or misunderstanding. It was part of a larger issue, one that stretched far beyond this single branch. He had hoped that maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe it was just a simple misunderstanding, an error in judgment. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that it wasn't an error. It was a pattern. A pattern he had seen reflected in countless stories from customers who had come to him for help. Stories of being treated differently, of being treated like second-class citizens, even when they were doing business with institutions that should have been serving them. The manager returned shortly after, a forced smile on his face. "I'm afraid we'll need to verify some more information before we can process the withdrawal," he said, trying to sound calm but failing to mask the unease in his voice. The CEO nodded slowly. He was done playing games. He had to speak up. He couldn't let this go any longer. He had a responsibility, not just to his own position or reputation, but to the customers who trusted his bank. He knew this was bigger than a simple transaction. This was about something much deeper. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice steady but full of authority. He knew he had to tread carefully. This wasn't just a simple conversation. It was a turning point. The manager's face drained of color. I'm not sure I understand," he stammered. "I am the CEO of this bank," the CEO said, his tone firm. "I have been a customer here for years, and I'm withdrawing my own money. But what just happened isn't right. This is the kind of treatment that countless others have faced, and you just did it to me." There was a moment of silence, one that felt heavy and uncomfortable. The manager's eyes widened, and for a brief second it seemed like he was trying to process what the CEO had said. His expression shifted from confusion to realization, and then to an awkward kind of regret. "I didn't know," the manager said, almost as though he were trying to excuse his actions. "I mean, we just follow procedures. I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding." The CEO shook his head. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's discrimination. You didn't question anyone else's withdrawal, did you? But you questioned mine, and now I know exactly why. The manager opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. He looked around as if trying to find something to say that would make it all right. But there was nothing. The damage had already been done. I'm going to make this right, the CEO said firmly. He had seen enough. His mind was made up. He needed to do more than just make a complaint. He needed to fix the problem at its roots. He stood up from the counter and glanced around the room. He could see the other employees watching him from a distance. The atmosphere had shifted, and for the first time that day, he felt like the whole bank was aware of what had just happened. They could all see that something was wrong. He wasn't going to let it slide. The CEO made his way to the manager's office where they sat down to talk further. The conversation was a delicate one. The manager was trying to defend the actions of the staff, but it was clear that he knew he couldn't justify what had just happened. The CEO, however, wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted action. He needed to know how deep the problem went and what they planned to do about it. I want to know exactly what you're doing to address this kind of behavior, the CEO said, leaning forward. I don't want to hear about procedures or excuses. I want real change. The manager hesitated before responding. We have diversity training, of course, and we try to address any issues as they come up. But sometimes things slip through the cracks. I mean, people are people, you know? The CEO couldn't help but feel frustrated by the response. Slipping through the cracks isn't good enough. This isn't just about training. It's about creating a culture where this doesn't happen in the first place. Where every customer is treated equally, no matter their race, no matter their background. The manager nodded, but the CEO could tell that the words weren't enough. He wasn't going to get the answers he wanted from him. It was clear that the manager, and likely many others in the bank, had no idea what it meant to truly confront the biases that were ingrained in their systems. But the CEO wasn't going to let them off the hook. Here's what I'm going to do, the CEO continued, his voice resolute. I'm going to personally oversee an investigation into this matter. I'll be looking at every aspect of this branch's operations, from the way staff interact with customers to the policies you enforce. We're going to take a hard look at everything, and if I find that this behavior isn't being addressed properly, there will be consequences. The manager sat back, visibly taken aback by the CEO's resolve. I understand, he said quietly, but I want to make things right. The CEO nodded. I hope you do. But it's not just about making things right for me. It's about making things right for everyone who walks into this bank and trusts us. That's the standard we're going to set. Anything less isn't acceptable. As the CEO walked out of the office, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was angry, yes, but he was also motivated. This wasn't the kind of moment that could be ignored or brushed under the rug. He had to act and act quickly. This wasn't just about making a statement to the bank staff. It was about making a statement to the entire organization. The culture had to change, and he would lead that change. He left the branch with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be resistance, but he also knew that this was the kind of work that mattered. He had always believed in doing the right thing, and now he had the chance to prove that belief was more than just words. The next few days felt like a blur for the CEO. He spent countless hours reviewing the details of the bank's operations, meeting with employees, and speaking to customers. Everywhere he turned, there were signs of the problems he had suspected all along. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how much work there was to do. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a systemic issue that had permeated the very foundation of the bank. The investigation he'd ordered was underway, but he didn't want to leave it solely in the hands of others. This was personal. This was about ensuring that his bank became a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could feel safe, valued, and respected. He couldn't let this go. Not now, not ever. One afternoon, after a series of frustrating meetings with his top management, the CEO decided to visit the branch again. He needed to see for himself how the employees were handling the new directives he had put in place. He couldn't just rely on reports and memos. He had to witness the changes firsthand. This time, however, he didn't go in disguised. He walked into the branch as the CEO, fully aware that his presence would send a message. He wanted the staff to know that he was serious about the changes he had promised. He wanted them to see that he wasn't just a figurehead sitting behind a desk somewhere. He was right there, in the heart of the operation, holding everyone accountable. As he walked through the doors of the branch, he immediately felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The bank had been around for years, and he had built it to serve communities that were often overlooked by larger financial institutions. But now he had to prove that it could be something more, something that truly prioritized fairness and equality. The tellers who had once given him the cold shoulder now seemed different. They were more alert, more engaged. When the CEO made his way to the counter, one of the tellers, a young woman with short curly hair, greeted him with a smile. It wasn't forced or uncomfortable. It was genuine. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice steady. The CEO nodded. "Afternoon. I'd like to make a withdrawal." She nodded and began the usual steps to process the transaction. This time there were no hesitations, no stammers. The exchange felt natural, almost as if the earlier tension had never existed. It was a small victory, but it gave the CEO a glimmer of hope. Perhaps things were starting to change, but he knew better than to jump to conclusions. A smile from a teller didn't mean everything was fixed. It was just one moment, one interaction. He needed to see more. He needed to know if the shift in culture was real or just surface level. He spent the next couple of hours observing the staff as they interacted with other customers. He watched them closely, noticing how they responded to people of different backgrounds. Some customers seemed to be treated with kindness and efficiency, while others, particularly those who appeared to be from minority communities, were given far less attention. It was subtle but undeniable. The CEO's heart sank. The work wasn't done. The changes he had initiated might have started, but they weren't enough. He had hoped that just putting in place new policies and holding employees accountable would make everything better. But the truth was more complicated. The biases ran deeper than he had imagined. They weren't just about following procedures. They were about unlearning years of ingrained behavior. He knew that this wasn't just a problem for the tellers. It was a problem for the entire organization. This was about the culture, about the way the bank was perceived and the way it operated at every level. He couldn't fix this by just issuing a few directives. He had to change the very mindset that had allowed discrimination to flourish in the first place. That evening, the CEO called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. They gathered in the conference room and he wasted no time getting to the point. "We're not done," he said, his voice firm. "What I saw today is not enough. I've seen some small improvements, but we're still not where we need to be." The team sat in silence for a moment, processing his words. The CEO could see the unease in their faces, but he wasn't interested in comforting them. This wasn't about their comfort. It was about creating real change. "We've put policies in place, yes, but what I saw today tells me that we have deeper issues to address. It's not just about following rules. It's about unlearning behavior that's been ingrained for far too long." The room was still. No one spoke. The CEO knew they understood the weight of what he was saying. He had given them a chance to prove that they could make the bank a better place. Now he was holding them accountable. They couldn't just go through the motions. They had to do the hard work. "We're going to double down on training," the CEO continued. "But not just any training. This has to go beyond diversity workshops. We need to confront the biases that exist within each of us. We need to create a culture that doesn't just tolerate diversity, but embraces it. We need to make sure every employee understands that our customers deserve to be treated equally, no matter who they are." The team nodded, some of them making notes, others exchanging glances. The CEO could feel the gravity of the moment. This was the turning point. It was no longer just about words or policies. It was about actions. And he was determined to make sure that those actions spoke louder than anything else. Over the next few weeks, the CEO continued to monitor the changes closely. He reviewed customer feedback, conducted surprise visits to branches, and listened carefully to what employees had to say. Some of the changes were slow, but they were happening. Slowly but surely, the culture of the bank was beginning to shift. Employees started to take the issue more seriously. They began to understand that they were not just working for a bank. They were working for an institution that had a responsibility to its community. But not everyone was on board. There were still employees who resisted the changes, who believed that things were fine the way they were. These employees were the hardest to reach, and the CEO knew that he would have to make tough decisions. Some would have to be let go. Some would need to be retrained. and some would simply have to leave the organization. He wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of the progress they had made. In the meantime, the CEO had started meeting with local community leaders to ensure that the changes they were making at the bank were aligned with the needs of the people they served. He wanted to make sure that the bank wasn't just doing the right thing for optics. He wanted to make sure they were genuinely making a difference in the lives of the people who had been the most affected by the system he was trying to dismantle. As he sat in these meetings, he was reminded of why he had started this journey in the first place. He had always believed that businesses had a responsibility to do more than just make money. They had to be forces for good in their communities. And now, he was seeing firsthand how much work there was to do. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but the CEO was determined to stay the course. He knew that real change took time, but he also knew that every step they took brought them closer to the goal of creating a truly equitable and just banking environment. He wasn't going to stop until they got there. The CEO had never expected change to come easily. It wasn't just the bank that needed transformation. It was a deeply rooted mindset that had to shift across the entire organization. And as much as he hoped that the staff would embrace the changes, he realized that the real work was only just beginning. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere at the bank continued to evolve. Some employees embraced the new policies, engaging in the diversity and inclusion training and taking the time to understand the biases they hadn't realized they carried. But for others, the change wasn't as simple. There was resistance even if it was quiet and unspoken. Some staff members resented the new direction, uncomfortable with the accountability they now had to face. The CEO had made it clear that there would be consequences for those who refused to adapt, but he didn't want to jump to drastic measures immediately. He wanted to give people a chance to reflect and improve. It was important to him that the change was genuine, not just a forced shift. But he also knew that if the resistance continued, he would have to make difficult decisions. He spent long hours going over feedback from the branches, reading through the complaints and speaking directly with the employees who seemed most affected by the new policies. Some of the older staff members were the hardest to convince. They had worked for years under the old system and were set in their ways. The CEO understood that it wouldn't be easy to undo decades of behavior, but he also knew it was necessary. It wasn't just about training or policies. It was about culture. And culture, he realized, was something that had to be modeled from the top down. If he, as the CEO, didn't live and breathe the change he was asking for, then nothing would shift. So he made a point to spend more time in the branches, talking with employees and customers. He wanted to be visible, to show everyone that he wasn't just issuing commands from an office somewhere. He was on the ground working with them side by side. He wanted them to see that he was as committed to this transformation as they needed to be. One day, after a particularly challenging meeting with the senior leadership team, the CEO decided to visit a different branch. This one was in a neighborhood that was known for being diverse with a large immigrant population. He knew that this particular branch had been struggling with a high turnover rate, and he suspected that some of the issues there were related to how customers of different backgrounds were treated. He wanted to see if his hunch was correct. As he walked through the front door, the first thing he noticed was the energy in the air. There was a sense of unease among the staff. A few employees were gathered at the front, speaking quietly among themselves, glancing over at him nervously. He didn't mind. He understood that they were unsure of his presence. But that didn't change why he was there. He had to see for himself how they were interacting with customers. He approached one of the tellers, a young woman who was new to the team. She smiled at him, her demeanor polite but a little reserved. He could tell that she was doing her best to follow the new procedures but was still uncertain about the changes. "How's everything going today?" he asked her casually. "Good, sir. We're just keeping up with the usual. A lot of customers coming in for withdrawals and a few for loans." The CEO nodded, but he was still keeping a close eye on the way the tellers were interacting with customers. He noticed that there were a couple of customers in line who were being overlooked. It wasn't anything overt, but there was a noticeable difference in how quickly the staff addressed them compared to the customers ahead of them. He could see it even if no one else seemed to notice. The nonverbal cues, the way some customers were given longer waits, or the way their questions were met with distracted responses, spoke volumes. After a few minutes, the CEO stepped out of line and approached one of the customers who had been waiting. He wanted to hear their experience firsthand. "Excuse me," he said, gently interrupting the man who was sitting in a chair near the counter. "I'm the CEO of this bank. I was wondering if you could share your experience with me today." The man looked surprised but smiled warmly. "Well, I've been waiting for a while," he said. "I'm not sure if it's just because of the time of day or what, but I've been here a good 20 minutes. I've seen others go ahead of me, even though I got here first." The CEO nodded, already understanding what had happened. He had seen it firsthand. He had witnessed the subtle disregard. This was exactly what he had been worried about. Even with the changes that had been made, there were still employees who carried those biases. Some weren't even aware of it. But it didn't matter. They were still creating an environment where customers felt like they weren't being valued. "Thank you for sharing that," the CEO said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll make sure this is addressed." As he walked back to the front desk, his heart was heavy. He knew that this wasn't just a one-off experience. This was a reflection of a much larger problem that needed to be tackled head-on. There was no more room for half measures. If the bank was going to survive in the way he had always envisioned, it had to be truly inclusive. It had to go beyond just saying the right things. It had to show in every action, in every customer interaction, in every decision. He didn't want to let the staff off easy, but he also knew they needed help. He couldn't just fire people or reprimand them without offering support. He needed to show them what real change looked like, and that meant investing in more hands-on, ongoing training. But this training couldn't just be about facts and statistics. It had to be about empathy. It had to be about showing staff how their actions impacted customers, how their biases, even if unintentional, shaped the environment around them. The CEO immediately scheduled a follow-up meeting with the branch manager. He was upset, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He wanted to hear from the manager directly before making any decisions. When the manager arrived, the CEO didn't waste time getting to the point. "There's something happening here that isn't right," the CEO said. "I've seen customers waiting unnecessarily, being treated with less respect than others and not receiving the attention they deserve. This is what I've been talking about. This is why we need real change." The manager's face dropped and he seemed to struggle for a moment before speaking. "I didn't realize it was this bad, sir. I thought the training would be enough. But I can see now that we need more. I'll work with the team. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The CEO sighed, his frustration evident. This isn't just about telling people what to do. It's about changing the way they see things. We have to look at the deeper issues, not just the surface level. As the meeting concluded, the CEO knew that the work ahead would be harder than he anticipated. There were no easy fixes and there were still many obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that if he could make these changes, the bank could be a model for the kind of institution he had always wanted it to be, one that treated every customer with dignity and respect, and that, he realized, was a fight worth having. The weeks following the CEO's visit to the branch were a whirlwind of activity. After his meeting with the manager, he had taken decisive steps to ensure that the issues he had witnessed would not be swept under the rug. He was determined to make sure this was not just another round of policy changes with little real impact. The work had to be ongoing, with every employee, from the tellers to the senior managers, involved in shaping a new culture at the bank. At first, the road to change had seemed straightforward. He had issued the new directives, expanded the training, and called for transparency. But as he learned firsthand, cultural change was a slow and sometimes painful process. The problems didn't go away overnight. In fact, new challenges arose, often in ways that no one could have predicted. One of the hardest parts of the transformation was seeing the resistance from some staff members. It wasn't always obvious, and sometimes it came in the form of subtle reluctance. Some employees didn't fully embrace the changes, and the CEO began to realize that it wasn't just about pushing for policies or conducting training sessions. It was about changing people's mindsets. People had to understand, not just intellectually but emotionally, that they were part of a larger mission, a mission to make the world a better place, to create a workplace where everyone, no matter their background, felt valued and respected. The CEO's approach was consistent. He would lead by example. He showed up at the branches regularly, participating in the same training sessions he was asking his employees to attend. He didn't want to just be the person issuing commands from behind a desk. He wanted to be a part of the solution. He wanted to show his employees that the work he was asking them to do was just as important for him as it was for them. He didn't want to be seen as a distant authority figure. He wanted to be seen as an ally in the effort to change. And gradually, over time, things started to improve. It wasn't immediate, and there were still hiccups along the way, but the employees who had once resisted began to come around. It wasn't that they were completely free of their biases or prejudices, but they began to see the value in the new direction the CEO was pushing for. They began to see how it made the bank stronger, how it made them better at their jobs. They started to realize that treating customers equally didn't just feel right. It also made good business sense. One of the most important changes the CEO initiated was the development of a new feedback system. He wanted the employees to have a way to speak up when they noticed things going wrong, or when they felt like the changes weren't being fully implemented. He didn't just want to hear from managers. He wanted to hear from everyone, from the tellers on the front lines to the back office workers. It was a way for the CEO to keep his finger on the pulse of what was really happening across the bank. The feedback he received was invaluable. Some employees shared stories of their own biases, while others talked about the ways in which they had seen their colleagues grow. It was clear that the transformation wasn't just about changing the way customers were treated. It was about transforming the way the staff treated each other. There was a new sense of unity, a shared understanding that everyone had a role to play in making the bank a better place. Still, the work wasn't done. The CEO knew that the true test of the bank's progress would come when they started dealing with larger issues. Would the bank still uphold its commitment to equality and fairness when faced with a difficult decision? Would they live up to their promises in the face of pressure from customers or other businesses? Those were the questions that kept him up at night. And then, one day, he received a phone call that tested everything the bank had worked so hard to achieve. A customer, a well-known community leader, came to the CEO with a serious complaint. The leader had come into one of the bank's branches to apply for a loan, and despite meeting all the necessary qualifications, the loan officer had denied the request. The reason given was vague, but the customer suspected it had something to do with his background. The community leader was well respected, but he was a person of color, and the CEO couldn't ignore the possibility that racial bias had played a role in the decision. The customer was upset, and understandably so. The CEO felt a deep sense of responsibility. This was a test of everything they had worked for. It would have been easy to brush it off or sweep it under the rug, but that was the old way. The new way was about being transparent and holding everyone accountable. The CEO immediately launched an internal investigation. He personally reviewed the loan officer's decision-making process and spoke with the customer to understand his experience. As he dug deeper, he found that the loan officer had followed the guidelines but had failed to fully consider the customer's background and the broader context of the loan application. It wasn't an overt act of discrimination, but it was still a missed opportunity to provide fair and equal treatment. The CEO took swift action. He met with the loan officer and the branch manager to discuss the situation. He reminded them that their work wasn't just about numbers and procedures. It was about understanding people. They needed to recognize when a customer's needs went beyond a simple transaction. In this case, the loan officer had failed to see the customer as more than just an application. The CEO also made sure the community leader's loan was approved immediately, apologizing for the inconvenience and making sure the customer felt heard and respected. But the real work wasn't just about fixing that one instance, it was about ensuring that something like this never happened again. The CEO pushed for new training that focused on understanding the broader context of customer interactions. The goal wasn't just to get through the paperwork. It was to create a deeper connection with every customer. They had to recognize that each customer brought their own history, their own challenges, and their own story to the table. The bank couldn't just treat them as numbers, it had to treat them as people. The incident with the community leader was a turning point for the entire bank. It served as a reminder of how fragile progress could be. The CEO knew that one mistake could undo months of hard work, but it also showed him how far they had come. The bank had responded with integrity. They hadn't ignored the issue, and they had taken immediate steps to correct it. As time passed, the CEO began to see more and more examples of customers being treated with the respect they deserved. The culture of the bank had slowly but surely begun to change. People were more aware of their actions, more aware of the impact their behavior had on others. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real. One day, the CEO walked into one of the branches and was greeted by a smiling teller who had been with the bank for years. She was no longer the hesitant, uncomfortable employee he had seen months ago. She was confident, engaged, and genuinely happy to help the customers who walked through the door. "Good afternoon, sir," she said warmly. "How can I help you today?" The CEO smiled, feeling a sense of pride. This was what progress looked like. It wasn't about one moment, one decision. It was about the daily interactions, the little things that added up over time. It was about creating a place where people felt welcome, where everyone was treated with dignity. He knew the work was far from finished, but in that moment, he felt hopeful. They had come a long way, and there was still so much more to do. But as long as he and his team stayed committed to the vision of a truly inclusive bank, they would continue to move forward. Together, they had begun to build something that was stronger, more just, and more meaningful than anything they had ever imagined.